In my head, you have held me in your arms. In my head, I've been witness to your charms 1,000 times. You have sung me a love song in my head.
Hello, and you are very welcome to this special edition of the Attic Sessions, which is celebrating acts of commission, a North-South collaboration by invitation of Belfast-based Quotidian, Words on the Street, and which features two poets, Nick Laird and Sinéad Morrissey, who were commissioned to write a poem for the festival, and we are going to hear each soon. But our first guest is Nick Laird, who was born in 1975 in County Tyrone, was a scholar at Cambridge, studied at Harvard, worked as a lawyer, and then began to publish his poetry and his fiction. He's published 4 collections of poetry, the most recent being Feel Free, which appeared in 2018, and 3 novels, the latest being Modern Gods, which appeared in 2017. And there is a new poetry collection coming out in the summer of 2023. So first we'll hear Nick read his poem, The Vocation.
It's all right for a poet to have some dirt beneath his fingernails or a piece of leaf caught in her hair. When you ask him how he's doing, it's fine for him to shuffle up the bench a bit to let the ghost sit down, or for her to pull a tangled length of metaphor out of her pocket to tie together all the losses. It's normal for a poet to choose to sit by the window while the novelists prefer the aisle. When poets turn on each other, they are like milk turning. When they love, they are children with money. They think their desk is an altar, and wearing that black sweater speaks of perpetual mourning. That staring at the ceiling is an hour spent thinking how the mundane deserves its beautiful due. And in the wallet of the poet sits the business cards they've printed up, declaring on one side, the statement on the other side is true. And on the other side, the statement on the other side's a lie.
That's super. That's super. And I can just picture that turning card all the time. But I'm wondering about the process of commission. How difficult it is if somebody says to you, I'd love you to write a poem. Does it feel, George Sanders talks about this idea that, art doesn't have a clear-cut intention. So you can't set out knowing what you plan to do, and presumably with a commission, there's some plan.
This was a very open commission, so it just was give us a poem. So that was the ideal kind of commission, because you don't have to go along a line, as it were. We hate poems that have designs on us. It's very hard to decide, well, I'm going to write a poem about X, Y, or Z. Maeterlinck, that Belgian poet, has a great line about nothing, however great, is guaranteed to make a poem, but something, however small, might. You never know where the poem comes from. And in the past, I think, I've had commissions, maybe, I remember doing one for the ambulance service in Northern Ireland, and just sat and looked at it for months and months and couldn't get a thing out at all, and suddenly realised that what I wanted to write about was driving up to my mother's hospice when she was dying in Newry Hospice of cancer, and an ambulance had sort of overtaken me, and I'd followed the ambulance for a while, driving up from Dublin to Newry, and then the poem came. But unless it sort of accidentally intersects with some of your concerns, I think you're on a hiding to nothing, really.
Mm-hmm. So there's
you hope for a bit of luck, I think.
And trust that the subliminal processes work and
always, yeah,
and find the way in. In this poem, you're playing with notions of identity. It seems like you're contrasting the experience of the novelist and the poet. The novelist prefers the aisle, the poet the window. And you, as we've said, are both a published novelist and a published poet. Is there that struggle within your own personality, the writing of each?
Well, they do different things, I suppose, and I quite like having a place to put other, thoughts, as it were, things that might not go into a poem can maybe be something I can explore better in fiction. But to be honest, I think when I was writing that poem, I was thinking more about my wife compared to me. She's a novelist, and she does prefer the aisle, and I prefer the window on a bus or a train or whatever it is. So she's interested, and I think novelists in general are much more interested in social dynamics, how people interact with each other, and the novelist is a bit more interested maybe in, looking out the window and daydreaming and sort of seeing the trees and the sky and not being very useful in some ways.
And can you do both at the same time? Can you be in the same mindset for both?
Well, I can't write them both at the same time, and if I'm trying to write a novel, I can't really write a poem. I'd have a kind of decompression period, of a day or two in between them, really. The novels would tend to become a wee bit kind of elliptical, and the poetry would kind of become a wee bit, prosy. So I do try and keep them separate. I don't know that I'll write, more fiction. I haven't got anything on the go at the minute. So unless something occurs to me that I want to write about, poetry is something that is always with me, and the poems kind of pop up. But you do need something else to do, and you're waiting for the poems to come along.
The subject matter, can it be that, I wonder sometimes, because I wrote one novel, but always found that I enjoyed narrative poetry. So do you think that there are very distinct subject matters for each?
In terms of?
Of whether there are some things that you just simply couldn't write in poetry, that you need the expansion of the novel to allow you to explore?
Poetry is a broad house and becoming broader all the time, but I'm not a great one for, say, prose poetry, and these little short flash fictions and stuff, I think they're all good and interesting, but I do like a poem that has a kind of a rhythmic drive and some kind of overarching formal necessity to it. Partly for myself, the poem sort of seems to come if there's something else driving it, some kind of principle behind it. I've never managed to get through a novel in verse, even like a poet as fantastic as Les Murray or whatever. I just couldn't finish them. It's just too. I tried Vikram Seth, The Golden Gate.
Yes.
I don't have the time or will, but that's probably me. I don't know. I think whenever there's something like that, a novel in verse, which is a rhyme thing, when you're waiting for the rhyme to click into place, it becomes just sort of overwhelmingly dull. Like you're just waiting for the next thing to go. So I want a wee bit of surprise. So I like lyric. Lyric excites me. You don't really know where you're going with it. You can feel the poet has entered into it in a kind of spirit of unknowingness and is surprising themselves with what they discover. And I think I want that as a reader too.
Have you written short stories? Because they say that the short story is a lot closer to the poem in terms of sometimes it is an image that sort of drives the...
one little thing that you'll see, like a scene. No, and the reason I think I haven't written them is because they are close to it. I wrote one very bad short story that's in an anthology somewhere, but I think for me they are similar. And that sometimes you'll alight on some kind of scenario or scene, and that will make a poem in some way, especially along with some wee verbal flicker, something interesting going on there. But no, I like the novel expansive thing. You look at people. It's a different kind of baggage restriction that you get in the poems. So particularly, I was born and brought up in Northern Ireland, and there's a lot of things I wanted to explore about Northern Ireland in fiction. Partly, I always felt that the narrative was not complicated in a way, and I wanted to complicate it in certain ways through fiction. And people like my parents, there wasn't a book in the house growing up, whatever, but they would have been able to, actually they didn't read my books, but they would have been able to read the books in a way. You're appealing to people maybe who wouldn't pick up a poetry book with a novel. So the reach is, I think, a bit wider in some ways. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, it's been a pleasure to talk to you about your poetry, and thanks for being part of the Attic Sessions.
Thanks for having me.
I dream, 'cause it's the closest I'll ever get to you.